The rifle barrel gleamed under the afternoon sun. Cold, silent, pointed directly at the chest of a 12-year-old boy. The royal guard's finger hovered near the trigger. His jaw was tight. His eyes burned with something between duty and fury. Around him, the entire courtyard had frozen. Noblemen in tailored suits, ladies in silk gowns, palace staff clutching trays and clipboards. Every single person stood paralyzed, afraid to breathe. At the center of it all stood the boy, Thomas, Camilla's son. His face was pale, but his chin was raised. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the man holding the weapon. No one understood why this was happening. Not yet. But before we go further into this moment, if you love stories that touch your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. It had started 3 hours earlier. Thomas had arrived at the palace with his mother for a formal luncheon. It was meant to be a quiet event. Camilla was there to meet with foreign dignitaries. Thomas, as always, was told to stay silent and polite. Be seen, not heard. That was the rule for children in royal settings. But Thomas was not like other children. He was observant, curious, the kind of boy who noticed things adults missed. And that morning, he had noticed something strange. During the reception in the grand hall, Thomas had wandered near the eastern corridor. It was quieter there, fewer guests, just staff moving between rooms. He had been looking at the old paintings on the walls when he heard voices. Low, tense, angry. He stopped. 2 men were standing near a service door. One was dressed in a palace uniform, a guard. The other man wore a dark coat. No uniform, no badge. His face was unfamiliar. Thomas stepped closer, staying in the shadow of a marble column. He shouldn't have been listening. He knew that, but something in their tone made his heart beat faster. The man in the dark coat was speaking quickly. His accent was thick, hard to place. He was holding a small black case. The guard was shaking his head, but his hands were trembling. "You do this or your family pays," the man in the coat said. His voice was like gravel. "You know what happens if you refuse?" The guard's face twisted. He looked sick, terrified, but then he nodded, slowly, reluctantly. The man in the coat handed him the black case. Then he walked away without another word. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know what he had just seen, but it felt wrong. Dangerous. He thought about telling someone. His mother. A staff member. But who would believe a 12-year-old boy? So he stayed quiet. For a while, the luncheon continued. Camilla sat at a long table with diplomats and royal advisors. Thomas sat 3 seats down, picking at his food. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. The case? The threat? The guard's terrified face. Then, halfway through the meal, Thomas saw him again. The same guard. Standing near the entrance to the dining hall, his uniform was perfectly pressed. His posture was straight. But his eyes were wrong, hollow, haunted, and in his hand. Barely visible beneath his jacket was the edge of that black case. Thomas's heart began to race. He looked around the room. No one else seemed to notice. Everyone was smiling, talking, clinking glasses. He had to do something. Thomas stood up from his seat. His mother glanced at him, confused. But before she could say anything, Thomas walked toward the guard. The room grew quieter. People began to notice. A child approaching a guard during a formal event? It was unusual, inappropriate. Thomas stopped a few feet away from the man. His voice was calm, but loud enough to be heard. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "What's in the case?" The guard's face went white. The entire room turned to look. Asterisk, asterisk, the silence that followed was suffocating. Every fork was lowered. Every conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the boy and the guard standing in the center of the room. Camilla's face drained of color. She rose from her seat, but her voice was caught in her throat. What was her son doing? The guard stared at Thomas. His hand tightened around the black case. Sweat beaded on his forehead. For a moment, it looked like he might speak, might explain. But then his expression changed. Something snapped behind his eyes. He stepped back, away from the boy. His hand moved to his belt, and in one swift motion, he pulled out his service rifle. Gasps echoed through the hall. "Stay back," the guard shouted. His voice cracked. "Everyone stay back!" Panic erupted. Guests stumbled out of their chairs. Advisors shouted orders. Security personnel rushed forward, but the guard swung the rifle toward them. "Don't move," he screamed. "I'll do it. I swear I'll do it." And then he turned the barrel toward Thomas. The boy stood perfectly still. His eyes were locked on the guard's face. He didn't run, didn't cry, just watched. Camilla screamed. She tried to move toward her son, but two guards held her back. "Thomas," she cried. "Thomas, get away from him." But Thomas didn't move. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas asked quietly. His voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. The guard's hand shook. His finger hovered near the trigger. "You don't understand," he said. His voice was raw, broken. "They have my daughter. They said they'd kill her if I didn't." He stopped. His chest heaved. Tears streamed down his face. "If you didn't what?" Thomas asked. The guard's jaw clenched. He glanced at the black case on the floor beside him, then back at the boy. "If I didn't plant the device," he whispered, "in the south wing?" During the signing ceremony, they said no one would get hurt. They said it was just to send a message. A cold wave of horror washed over the room. A bomb. There was a bomb in the palace. Camilla's legs nearly gave out. The head of security barked orders into his radio. Guards began evacuating the guests. But the man with the rifle didn't lower his weapon. "Where is it?" Thomas asked. His voice was still calm. "Where did you put it?" The guard shook his head violently. "I can't tell you. If I tell you, they'll know. They're watching. They'll kill her. My little girl. She's only 8 years old." Thomas took a step forward. "Don't," the guard shouted, raising the rifle higher, but Thomas didn't stop. He took another step, then another. "Thomas, no," Camilla screamed. The boy stopped just a few feet from the barrel of the gun. He looked up at the guard. His eyes were soft, understanding. "What's her name?" Thomas asked. The guard blinked, confused. "What?" "Your daughter," Thomas said. "What's her name?" The man's face twisted. His lips trembled. "Sophie," he whispered. "Her name is Sophie." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sophie's lucky to have a dad who loves her so much." The guard's breath hitched. A sob escaped his throat. "But if that bomb goes off," Thomas continued gently, "a lot of other kids are going to lose their parents. A lot of Sophies out there won't have anyone to protect them." The guard's hands began to shake harder. The rifle wavered. "You're not a bad person," Thomas said. "You're scared. I can see that. But you can still do the right thing. You can still save everyone, including Sophie." Tears poured down the man's face. His whole body trembled. "They'll kill her," he choked. "If I help you, they'll kill her." Thomas shook his head. "Not if we find her first. But we need to know where the bomb is. Right now, before it's too late." The guard looked around the room. At the terrified faces, at Camilla, sobbing, being held back by security. At the advisors and staff who had trusted him, he closed his eyes, and then, slowly, he lowered the rifle. "The library," he whispered. "It's in the old library, behind the statue of King Edward, taped under the desk. It's set to go off in 20 minutes." Chaos erupted. Security rushed toward the library. Bomb disposal teams were called. The evacuation sped up. Guests were herded out of the building in a frantic wave. But Thomas didn't move. He stood there, looking at the man who had just pointed a gun at him. The guard dropped to his knees. The rifle clattered to the floor. He buried his face in his hands and wept. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry." Thomas knelt down beside him. He placed a small hand on the man's shoulder. "We'll find her," Thomas said quietly. "I promise." And in that moment, the entire royal court realized something. This boy had just saved them all. The palace courtyard was a storm of movement. Police cars, bomb squad vans, ambulances lined up just in case. Guests were being escorted to safety outside the gates. Camilla stood near the fountain, her arms wrapped tightly around Thomas. She hadn't let go of him since the moment the guard lowered his weapon. Her hands were still shaking. "Why did you do that?" She whispered into his hair. Her voice was raw, broken. "You could have been killed." Thomas looked up at her. His face was calm. Too calm for a 12-year-old who had just stared down the barrel of a gun. "I had to, ma'am," he said simply. No one else was listening to him. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. She pulled him closer. She didn't know whether to scold him or hold him forever. So she did both. Inside the library, the bomb squad worked quickly. The device had been exactly where the guard said it would be. A crude but deadly explosive. Wires. A timer. Enough power to collapse half the wing and kill anyone nearby. They disarmed it with 11 minutes to spare. The head of security walked out of the building, sweat dripping down his temples. He radioed the all-clear. A collective exhale swept through the crowd. But the nightmare wasn't over. The guard, his name was Daniel Fletcher, had been taken into custody. He sat in a holding room inside the East Wing, handcuffed, head bowed. His face was wet with tears. 2 officers stood by the door, watching him closely. But Thomas insisted on being there. Camilla had tried to stop him. So had the head of security. "He's a child," they said. "He shouldn't be involved in this." But Thomas was stubborn. "He told us about the bomb because I talked to him," he said. "And now we need to find Sophie. He'll talk to me." Reluctantly, they allowed it. Camilla stayed close by, just outside the room, watching through the glass. Thomas sat down across from Daniel. The man wouldn't look at him. His shoulders were slumped, defeated. "They're going to throw me in prison," Daniel said quietly. "I'll never see her again." Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "Where is she?" He asked, "Where did they have Sophie?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. They never told me. They just sent me pictures, videos, proof that they had her." "When did they take her?" 3 days ago," Daniel whispered. "She was walking home from school. I got a call that night." A man's voice. He said if I wanted to see her again, I had to do exactly what they told me. Thomas leaned forward. "Do you still have the videos?" "The pictures?" Daniel nodded slowly. "On my phone? They took it when they arrested me." Thomas stood and walked to the door. He spoke quietly to one of the officers. Minutes later, the phone was brought in. It was placed on the table between them. Thomas scrolled through the messages. There were 3 videos. Each one showed a little girl with blonde hair and frightened eyes sitting in a dim room. She wasn't hurt, but she was scared. Behind her, a concrete wall. A small window with bars. Thomas studied the videos carefully. He paused, rewound, watched again. "Do you recognize this place?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, I've never seen it before." But Thomas had. He zoomed in on the window in the background. Through the bars, there was a faint reflection. Blurry but readable if you looked closely enough. "Hargrave Industrial Storage," Thomas read aloud. "Unit 12. Daniel's head snapped up. "What?" Thomas turned the phone toward him. "Look. In the window reflection. It's a sign." Daniel stared at the screen. His breath caught. "How did you—" Thomas didn't answer. He was already walking toward the door. "We need to go there now." The head of security mobilized a team immediately. Hargrave Industrial Storage was a rundown facility on the edge of the city. Abandoned units. Graffiti on the walls. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions. Thomas, against Camilla's protests, rode in the lead vehicle. She sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "Let the police handle this." But Thomas shook his head. Sophie's scared. When they find her, she's going to need to see someone who isn't in a uniform. Someone who isn't shouting orders. She needs to know she's safe. Camilla looked at her son. Really looked at him. And she realized something she had always known but never fully understood. He wasn't just brave. He was compassionate. Wise beyond his years. The kind of person who saw the world differently than everyone else. The convoy arrived at the storage facility just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Unit 12 was in the far corner. The metal door was locked. The officers surrounded it, weapons drawn. Police. Open the door. No response? They breached the door with a battering ram. The metal screeched. Inside, the unit was dark, cold. The smell of rust and mildew hung in the air, and there, in the corner, huddled under a torn blanket, was a little girl, Sophie. She screamed when the flashlight beams hit her face. She curled into a ball, shaking. "It's okay," one of the officers said gently. "You're safe now." But Sophie didn't move. She just kept shaking. Thomas stepped forward, slowly, carefully. He knelt down in front of her. "Sophie," he said softly, "my name is Thomas. Your dad sent me to find you." The little girl's eyes flickered toward him. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "My dad?" she whispered. Thomas nodded. "He loves you so much. He did something really brave today to keep you safe. And now you get to see him again." Sophie's face crumpled. She reached out, and Thomas pulled her into a hug. She sobbed into his shoulder, her small body trembling. Camilla stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her own face. She watched her son hold this frightened little girl and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Sophie was rushed to the hospital for a checkup. She was dehydrated, scared, but physically unharmed. And when Daniel was brought to see her under police escort, the reunion broke everyone in the room. But the question remained. Who had done this? Who had threatened Daniel? Who had planted the plan? The answer would come soon, and it would shock everyone. The investigation moved quickly. Within hours, intelligence teams traced the phone number that had contacted Daniel. It led them to a small apartment in the city. When they raided it, they found two men. Both were hired criminals. Low-level operatives. But they weren't the masterminds. Under interrogation. They gave up a name, Victor Renault. The room went silent when the name was spoken. Victor. Renault was a disgraced former advisor to the royal family. Years ago, he had been caught embezzling funds meant for charitable foundations. He was quietly dismissed, his reputation destroyed. He disappeared from public life. But he never forgot the humiliation, and he had been waiting for revenge. His plan had been simple but cruel. Kidnap the daughter of a loyal guard. Force him to plant a bomb during a royal event. The explosion would have killed dignitaries, advisors, and members of the royal family. It would have been chaos. A national tragedy. And Victor would have watched from the shadows. Finally satisfied. But he hadn't counted on one thing. A 12-year-old boy who paid attention. When the news broke, the entire nation was stunned. Headlines filled every newspaper and screen. Boy hero stops palace bombing. Young royal saves lives with courage and compassion. But Thomas didn't care about the headlines. He sat in the hospital waiting room with Sophie. She was holding a stuffed rabbit the nurses had given her. Her father sat beside her, his hand gently stroking her hair. He was still in custody, but they had allowed him this moment. This reunion. Daniel looked at Thomas. His eyes were red. His voice was hoarse. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You saved my daughter. You saved everyone." Thomas shook his head. "You saved everyone," he said quietly. "You told the truth, even when you were scared. That's what heroes do." Daniel's face crumpled. He reached out and pulled Thomas into a hug. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The royal court held an emergency session the following week. Daniel Fletcher's case was reviewed. His actions had been coerced. He had been a victim as much as anyone else. And when it mattered most, he had chosen to do the right thing. The court showed mercy. Daniel was sentenced to community service and probation, but he would not go to prison. He would be able to stay with his daughter, rebuild his life. When the decision was announced, Sophie cried. So did Daniel, and so did Camilla, watching from the gallery with Thomas by her side. But the story didn't end there. A month later, the palace held a private ceremony. It was small, intimate, just family, close advisors, and a few honored guests. Thomas stood in the grand hall wearing a crisp suit. Camilla stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. The king himself was present, along with members of the royal family. The king stepped forward. In his hands was a medal, a symbol of bravery and service. Thomas, the king said, his voice echoing through the hall, you acted with courage when others were paralyzed by fear. You showed compassion when it would have been easier to stay silent. You saw a man in pain and chose to help him even at great risk to yourself. Because of you, lives were saved. A child was returned to her father, and a tragedy was averted. He placed the medal around Thomas's neck. This is the Medal of Valor, the king continued. It is given to those who demonstrate extraordinary bravery in the face of danger. You were the youngest person ever to receive it. The room erupted in applause. Camilla wiped tears from her eyes. Thomas stood there, looking slightly embarrassed, but also proud. After the ceremony, Daniel and Sophie were invited to attend. Sophie ran up to Thomas and threw her arms around him. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my dad. Thomas smiled. He saved himself, he said. I just reminded him that he could. Camilla watched her son with a heart full of pride. She had always known he was special, but now the world knew it too. As the guests began to leave, Thomas stood on the palace balcony looking out over the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Camilla joined him. How do you feel? She asked. Thomas thought for a moment. Grateful, he said, that I was there, that I could help. Camilla smiled. She wrapped her arm around him. You know, most 12-year-olds would have run away, but you walked toward the danger. Why? Thomas looked up at her. His eyes were calm, steady, 'cause someone had to listen, he said simply. Everyone was so scared they forgot to see him as a person, a dad who was terrified for his daughter. If I had run away, no one would have heard him, and Sophie might have never come home. Camilla's throat tightened. She pulled him close. You have the heart of a king, she whispered. Thomas shook his head. I just have a heart, ma'am, and I think everyone does. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them. And in that moment, standing on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, Camilla realized something profound. Her son would grow up to change the world, not because of a title or a crown, but because of who he was. A boy who saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. The story spread far beyond the palace walls. It became a symbol of hope, of compassion, of the power of one person to make a difference. And years later, when people told the story, they would say the same thing. A guard pointed his rifle at Camilla's son. But instead of fear, the boy offered understanding. Instead of running, he stood his ground. And because of that, lives were saved. A family was reunited, and the world was reminded that even in the darkest moments, kindness can be the greatest weapon of all. Thomas never forgot that day. Neither did Sophie. Neither did Daniel. And neither did anyone who witnessed. What true courage really looks like, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act with love. Even when you're terrified. That is the story of the guard who pointed his rifle at a prince, and the boy who refused to let him fall,